This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome, everyone, to Law and Literature in and from the Global South. I am Hector Hoyos, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you all to our discussion today. We're going to wait for a minute, actually, in awkward silence while people trickle in. This is late in the Zoom era. It's currently May 11th, 2023. We've been doing this for something like 3 years and a half, and it doesn't get easier. So it's a fantastic ersatz of in-person conversation and hopefully just the preliminaries of future in-person gatherings. I see folks trickling into the attendance. So Gianluca, Beatriz, Heian, Leslie, Yifan, and Yurim, great to see you all. We'll start in a couple minutes. Welcome, Veronica. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Okay, let's slowly start. We've done our share of awkward silence. It's long enough. So what I'd like us to do, here's a quick overview of our meeting today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the efforts at Stanford to do really kindred research in a shared area of study. Welcome, Professor Cantor. I just saw you walking into the room. I'm going to introduce our speakers who are going to tell us about the special issue that they prepared on the topic, and that it's really, one of the first interventions into this field from this configuration. So all the more reason to engage. We're going to have a broad-ranging conversation about the direction of the interdiscipline, where it's headed, where it's going. Welcome, Miguel Rábago Dorbecker from Mexico City. And if time permits, we're going to talk about Professors Babcock and Leman's current research. We are striving for about an hour, but we also have allocated an hour and a half if folks want to stay in. And after the recorded portion, we'll open it up for anyone who'd like to intervene, maybe even turn on their cameras. Welcome, Mithi, as well. Okay, so about the group trajectory here. Joseph Wager, who is coordinating and leading this group also on the intellectual side of things, and currently a grad student at Stanford, and myself, have been since the academic year 2021-2022, so the previous academic year, under the auspices of Stanford Global Studies, leading a series called Law and Literature in/from the Global South. At one point, we had to recur to that awkward slash to indicate something about the orientation of the group. We have held something like, I want to say 8 or 10 events already, including, for instance, thinking through the heuristic anti-colonial interdisciplinarity with Susanna Draper, Samara Esmer, Joey Slaughter. We organized a screening and discussion of the film Argentina in 1985, had a talk by Prathama Banerjee called Uncredible Fictions and Thinking the Political. We engaged with Jurba Mitra on her analysis of the genre of policy reports, especially in regards to women's issues in the Global South. That was quite fascinating. We engaged with Graham Daniel Willis' work on disappearances and carcerality. Most recently, we had an event called Anti-Colonial Interventions in Law and Literature with folks like Jarvis McInnes, Luis Carcamo Wechante, Yovita Goyal. That is going to become a published journal special issue through Occasion at the Stanford Humanities Center. We may invite other interlocutors in the series, such as Beth Payatot, Marco Juan, Alberto Acosta, Alice Bertenthal, Diana Guzman, Alison Bigelow. So, just some names and a sense of the kind of activities that we've been doing and the kind of learning and the crewing that has been happening in the group over time. So when Joe came upon your work, David and Peter, we felt, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This is such an opportunity. Let's see how we can, cross-pollinate, collaborate, look for synergies. I hate that very corporate word, but you see the spirit of where it's coming from. So let me introduce our guest today. Professor David Babcock is an associate professor of English and affiliate faculty of the African, African American, and Diaspora Studies Center at James Madison, specializes in 20th and 21st century global Anglophone literature. He's currently completing a book manuscript on how Anglophone novels imagine the work of professionals in postcolonial and globalizing contexts. His work has appeared in the most distinguished journals in the field: PMLA, Cultural Critique, Modern Fiction Studies, the Journal of Global Postcolonial Studies, and we'll talk about names and journals later today, I'm sure, Diaspora, Novel, a form of fiction, and Contemporary Literature. Meanwhile, his co-editor and collaborator, Peter Leman, is an associate professor of English and affiliate faculty member in Africana Studies at BYU. So not far from California, if you think about it. It's in the West. It's just a very short flight away. Hope to see you here soon, Peter. He specializes in 20th and 21st century global Anglophone and postcolonial literatures, particularly Anglophone African literature, Northern Irish literature, law and literature, colonial and postcolonial legal history, and fictions of emergency and dictatorship. He trained here in California at Irvine, where he received his PhD in English in 2011. His works include the monograph Singing the Law, Oral Jurisprudence and the Crisis of Colonial Modernity in East Africa. And similarly, Peter has published widely in distinguished journals in the field. So without further ado, and thanks everyone for indulging in that longish introduction, we want to hear from you. How did this journal come about? What can folks find there? Why should we keep thinking also with the work that you have done? I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. David, do you want to go first, or?
Well, yeah, I think
it started with you, right? I think you reached out to me originally with the opportunity to co-edit this. So,
yeah, so this came from a panel at the PMLA conference that was sort of back in, I believe it was 2013. So a very different landscape for kind of international or for kind of collaboration on this topic. But yeah, I think after that session, we got to talking about the Komaroff book, Theory from the South, and kind of saw that as a kind of theoretical manifesto that we could pick up on to create or to try to imagine what the actual work that they were kind of asking for would actually look like. And so that's where, kind of as our starting point, as our baseline, we were looking for work that takes seriously how Global South literature and law theorize themselves. And I think that's where our CFP was coming from, and I think that's where the articles that were ultimately published, what they were doing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forced David to jump right in there, but I want to say thank you for inviting us, and thank you for the introductions. I'm sure David shares that gratitude. This is a great opportunity. It's always gratifying when you find out that someone has read your work out in the world, and we put a lot of effort into this, a lot of heart and time into this issue. We're very proud of it, and so thank you for taking it seriously. Thank you for finding it and reading it and giving us the chance to be here.
Yeah, and just to quickly add, welcome Gianluca and Mithi are both here.
Yeah,
two of our contributors.
Yeah, I was excited to see that. We've never met personally, so it's nice to meet virtually, I guess. Yeah, so I'll just add a little bit there that I in my own work, I I trained with Brooke Thomas at UC Irvine. He's one of the people that I worked with there, and one of the kind of big figures in law and literature in its early days, but an Americanist. And he actually started out as a James Joyce scholar. His first book was on Ulysses, and he said he was teaching in Germany and teaching American literature and got interested and saw these connections between law and literature. But he said, but I didn't know anything about Irish law, but I knew a lot about American literature or American law. So he sort of got into that. And when I started working with him, I thought, well, why didn't you stick with it? Well, you could have learned about Irish law, right? There's probably some really interesting things going on there. And started working on this Ugandan writer, Okot Batek, who, if we have time, I'd be happy to kind of share the story of how my work on learning about Okot Batek and his oral poetry that is deeply interested in and a part of an Acholi legal tradition kind of got me thinking about this idea of, coming to law and literature that had sort of got into these habits, right? It's sort of, as a discipline, was sort of in these kind of habitual modes, but how could we sort of think differently about that relationship, right? About that relationship coming from these places where that have been touched by and colonized by the Anglo-American legal tradition to some extent, but have pushed back against that, have sort of offered other ways of being in the world, as Mithi puts it in her essay, right? So when David and I were on that panel together, we started some conversations, and it eventually kind of led to this opportunity to let's think differently about law and literature. Could we find methodologies? Could we find ways of doing this work, of exploring this relationship, right? That isn't dependent entirely on these kind of habitual methodologies that are valuable, right? And it's not to dismiss them, but I think there's a kind of what's the metaphor? Procrustean kind of possibility, right? A Procrustean danger, right? With some of these, when you sort of go into East African literature, for example, and say, oh, I'm just going to take traditional law and literature methodology and just slap it on. So we hope that this was kind of bringing some new possibilities to light. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and to kind of expand on that, Archer, I think for me, kind of coming to the field maybe from a slightly different place. I think when I was a grad student, I was very interested in kind of postcolonial theory and postcolonial studies without a kind of law and literature, without kind of the law and literature background, but then kind of coming to it later on in my dissertation phase. I think what it kind of offered was this kind of amazing kind of concreteness that had been completely lacking in my sort of engagement with postcolonial studies up to that point. I felt like at that point, postcolonial studies was, something that kind of was capable of generating, concepts and kind of ideas of practice. But I often found those concepts to be kind of abstract. And I think what law and literature, I think what I saw is that law and literature can bring to that are all of these very kind of specific and time sensitive scenarios through which postcolonial concepts and kind of the intellectual trees that have kind of come from those and the other methodologies could be really shown to make a direct difference. For instance, I'm thinking of in the Aftab piece in this collection, the sexual subaltern in court, right? You have this somewhat familiar concept of unrepresentability, or kind of the unrepresentability of the subaltern. But this is a situation where Aftab is talking about this kind of specific situation where someone was able to mount a successful legal defense because of the concept of the theoretical concept of unrepresentability. And that seemed to me to be kind of incredibly powerful and incredibly rich. And so that's where I think, for me, it was definitely kind of revitalized, at least my engagement with postcolonial studies.
Let me interject here, because I want for also those who are not familiar with your work to hear a quote from your introduction, right? In keeping with what Peter was saying a moment ago, you both write that modernity and modern law today are products of colonialism, right? So that's even a more decisive way of framing it than, Peter, what you were just saying, that so many spaces have been colonized by the Anglo-American legal tradition, right? There's that, and there's also this additional dimension, right? Modernity and modern law today are products of colonialism. So you have all these kinds of like chicken and egg questions to deal with.
Yeah.
So that would be one quote, and then another is for a little further down, and this connects, I think, with what David, you were articulating. You write that law must operate in the global South without the stabilizing illusion of universality or objectivity that it has for many authorities in the North. So, just giving your words back to you, and yeah, how does that read, right? I mean, for you all today, after you've published this and continue to think about these issues.
Yeah, that's. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think for me, yeah, I mean, this is something that, as kind of global South studies has become a more kind of powerful methodology and refiguring and kind of rethinking of some of those early post-colonial concepts. I think there's kind of this kind of deeper theoretical intervention about sort of the ways that location and space make a decisive difference in how concepts come into being and come into the world, right? Concepts themselves have a temporality. And so, this for me is a way of kind of continuing what I was trying to articulate earlier, where law and literature kind of offers a paradigm through which those things can be pinpointed much more kind of precisely than, in kind of more abstract discussions.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those quotations. I remember when I was my work on East Africa started as a dissertation, and when I was kind of trying to develop it into a book, I remember getting some pushback from some people, from some publishers and stuff, saying, well, this is so narrow, it's just about East Africa, this isn't really and yet I felt that no, the cases that I'm studying here, are kind of looking at this series of moments in the history of modernity, right? And the sort of deployment of colonial law that seemed to me to resonate much more widely, right? And so I was interested when I found reading some of Peter Fitzpatrick's work and some other people who just straight up say modern law is colonial, right? It's not incidentally, it's not, it is, and so I think that language of being a product of colonialism came from kind of connecting that sense that I had that there's something kind of bigger going on here in East Africa. This isn't just a kind of, narrow local regional phenomenon, but there is, as part of this sort of global kind of, I don't know, global South, global experience of a certain form of law, that this points to a kind of deeper. And actually, I was kind of looking back at our introduction, and I realized there are parts of this that I think I would state even more strongly now.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
That there's somewhere, I think I wrote something to the effect that there are, the ghosts of colonialism continue to haunt aspects of American law, and I thought, no, they don't. No, they don't haunt this. There aren't ghosts. This is still colonial, right? Particularly in terms of, this is getting ahead, but some of the work I'm doing now, I'm kind of looking at Native American, some indigenous kind of issues around law and literature, and I was sitting next to an activist at this protest up in Salt Lake City, and I was telling him I do post-colonial literature, and he's an indigenous person, and he looked at me and laughed, and he goes, "Post-colonial, that's nice. We're still colonized people." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." Very humbling to be told that, and so I think I would state it even more strongly now.
We heard something very similar, Peter, from Luis Cárcamo Echante, who is a Mapuche intellectual and scholar and a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he made just the same remark. Post, really post.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was a time, in grad school where we talk about neocolonialism, right? And we thought that was this kind of clever new thing, but as a response to the post, but I don't know, but it seems that that was always the case, right? We didn't really, we wanted to be post. It's sort of a, I suppose, useful kind of historical designation, but it does tend to conceal the ongoing kind of colonial imperial devices, particularly in the law, right, that we see deployed everywhere. So,
David, I want to get back to something that you mentioned, which was this concreteness, right? Could you tell us more about that? I mean, and I might editorialize here a bit. The way that registered with me is sometimes in the name of, say, the decolonial or the postcolonial, right? Pick your prefix. There are a bunch of realities on the ground that are jumbled together, and they are somehow distilled into an academic attitude without necessarily engaging with the specifics. It's almost like they become variables, right? So the case about the person who defended such and such argument, or the poem that revealed another aspect about the concept of autonomy, what have you, right? Is that what you meant? What is the concreteness? Where does that play out?
Well, I think like well, kind of as a kind of methodological thing on the part of the scholar, where they kind of place, they take the literary work and they kind of put it in a place of kind of reception that kind of is encompassed by the law, right? So I think, the one example, I mean, with I think the off-top piece, my kind of reference to that was admittedly a partial one. I think also it allowed them to sort of to go from the concrete to kind of larger theoretical questions about how kind of desire circulates within society, and can this kind of brilliant conclusion at the end about sort of the way that kind of queer desires and different kinds of unacknowledgeable, unrepresentable desires are still felt and still transmitted, despite the fact that they're unrepresentable, right? To me, that theoretical point like came out of this kind of the courtroom, right? This courtroom scenario, right? That is the concrete. I think another example from the collection, I think from Gianluca Parolin, who kind of argues in kind of a symmetrical direction or an opposite direction, where that essay kind of focuses on the way in which kind of law enforcement in Egypt and at this time itself is based on this kind of very abstract legal positivism. And this, I think, resonates with something that Peter was saying earlier about sort of the law as a kind of continuing colonial and colonized presence. And so the Ramadan TV series in that article, serves this counter role of kind of concretizing the part of the law that has become abstract, kind of forcing people to see how those kind of abstract legal applications become, how they look in kind of more living human scenarios. So yeah, I think that concreteness can be achieved in a couple different ways, but I think it's the kind of law as lens that allows that to happen. And I hope Gianluca can speak to that maybe a little bit later.
Fantastic. Yeah, it seems that abstraction itself, right, can place an uneven burden on subjects of study, right? Some subjects of study are abstracted, others are concretized, and that's one dimension in which we I guess have to remain vigilant. I wanted to ask you something about the configuration of the journal. And it's telling that you published in a journal called the Journal of Commonwealth and Postcolonial Studies, that has since become the Journal of Global Postcolonial Studies, right? So my read of that shift is that the term global, and remember, we operate under the aegis of Stanford Global Studies, and we're very grateful for the support of Stanford Global Studies. It's a real entity, but also the term global has become operative in recent years, leading to parent structures such as the one here at Stanford and in other universities. You could say that the global has been absorbing as a framing indeed the Commonwealth or the post-colonial? Now, the danger is that sometimes we don't see the traces of what lies behind these framings. I noticed that I think Gianluca, who I also hope to hear from him soon, teaches at Aga Khan University in London, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that the authors in your special issue are all somehow institutionally located in the global north. Is that the case? And how do we, work around that problem? And believe me, that's also a problem for the group that Joseph and I are leading at Stanford, right? It's another chicken and egg, kind of like recursive or circular issue that you want to engage with an episteme that is also not, as it happens, like enormously well-funded, or a series of way of thinking the world, and they don't naturally produce research universities. I can tell you that, the Cuban patriot Jose Martí at the end of the 19th century was imagining a great Universidad del Sur, University of the South, where people from the United States would go to study, and this was kind of like a counterfactual fantasy. And you know what? That has happened very little. There are few and far in between scholars who make that trajectory in itself such a commentary on geopolitics. So, long way of asking, is the work Commonwealth-centric? How post-colonial? How global? How do you see those variables playing out?
Yeah, those are great questions, difficult questions. I think, I've had similar questions about the global. I mean, in some ways, these are useful designations. I think, I find the kind of concern about continuing to sort of tie our historical kind of periods to colonialism through designations like the post-colonial, interesting debates, and I can sort of recognize the difficulties with that. But then, there's the danger of a kind of a sort of flattening when everything sort of becomes part of the global, right? And I mean, one of the things that I think I love about our issue is that I mean, the readings themselves are sort of very specific. I was about to say concrete, but we kind of parse that term a little bit already. I don't want to jump back into that, but there's a kind of, getting into, like, in the first one, the questions of dharma and moksha as this sort of these concepts specific to this part of India that sort of take us outside of and are sort of functioning, external to, but as a critique of colonial law, British colonial law. I mean, the sort of specificity of that, cultural specificity, locational specificity. I think that kind of, these essays take us into this sort of dynamic, very kind of varied terrain, right? That might be flattened out by the global, but when we sort of get into those sort of granular readings, I think there's so much kind of richness. But as far as the institutional question, that's a challenge, and in some ways we got the submissions that we got, so just kind of a practical response to that, and I'm very happy with the submissions that we got, but it did make me wonder, to what extent was this our call for papers, for example, limited by the sort of institutional structures, right? We tried to put it out there, we tried to advertise it widely, but I tried to send it, to colleagues in Africa and elsewhere, and but it may not have been distributed in the same way. It may not have been. We may not have done that very well. Trying to sort of reach some institutions that where there's no doubt. I mean, I know there's really exciting work being done, but tend to get excluded from these sort of global North networks, right? David, did you have?
Yeah, I mean, that's very well said, and I've been thinking a lot along those lines as well. Yeah, I think the world has come a long way, though, since since when this call for papers went out. I think a lot has changed in terms of kind of the infrastructure for kind of finding and kind of distributing a CFP like this, and probably we know a little bit more from having done this.
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think, certainly just as a starting point, right, the kind of the institutional normalization of Zoom, as what we're doing right now has made kind of a lot of intercontinental a collaboration much more kind of realistic and kind of potentially sustained. I think here at JMU, James Madison University, my home institution, our Africana Studies Center is starting to sort of grow its fellowship program, and trying to offer traditional fellowships where people are brought to campus, but also more Zoom-based fellowships, right? That where someone is working kind of with a certain department over the course of a semester. But staying at their home institution. So I think the kind of potential for networks and potential to be kind of more have more kind of like not just kind of more specific awareness of work that's going on on other continents, but also kind of maybe being able to distribute and outreach more effectively. I think those are all there. I mean, one thing that I also kind of one other point I've been dwelling on a lot kind of preparing for this is how it's the circulation of the CFP, but it's also finding peer reviewers, right? I think that the peer review network also has to be kind of intercontinental as well, because it kind of one way that things get kind of rechanneled into kind of familiar epistemes is when they get sent to kind of US-based or sort of purely US-based reviewers. So I don't think that's a simple adjustment. I don't think it's simply a matter of like, oh well, when you need a reviewer, like cast a wider net. I think it starts with a more sustained conversation, right? I think that has to happen about kind of what are the desired outcomes of academic work? What are the stakes of it? What is scholarship trying to achieve? I think all these things have they look so differently on different continents.
For sure. And since we are kind of like stuck with the English language as the lingua franca, we might as well use it. While making room, and I think your collection makes room for the other languages, that are part of the conversation, and they are all of them touched by English. It's complicated. But part of the reason why I'm bringing this up, when going back, Peter, to what you said in your opening remarks about being colonized by the Anglo-American legal tradition, I know scores of individuals who might say, well, because there are good things about being colonized by the Anglo-American tradition in various locales. One context that I'm familiar with is the 1991 constitutional reform in Colombia that happened under great duress as part of the war on drugs. And what prevailed was the importation wholesale of many elements from the Anglo-American tradition. And people will salute this as something that indeed, produced great stability in the country legally and otherwise, and was a huge instrument in facilitating overcoming decades of war. I know that the peace treaty itself was not signed until just a few years ago, but it was a big before and after. The paradox there is, of course, that had the war on drugs not been unleashed by Richard Nixon in 1971, okay, thinking just speculating, counterfactuals, Colombia wouldn't have been in shambles in 1991, right? And needed to be rebuilt according to Anglo-American legal tradition. So I don't know. My question there to you is, how do you deal with the Faustian bargain? The moment when the fact that English is a common language allows these scholarly exchanges to happen. The fact that the Anglo-American legal tradition has become globalized actually allows us to have, a footing in conversation, even when addressing something like Dharma, right? As in the meaty piece that you were addressing. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, these are great questions. What I guess it's just not. I mean, it's not a straightforward thing because as you were saying that, the describing how the Anglo-American, tradition or aspects of the legal tradition were brought into Colombia. I mean, what occurred to me was, yeah, but the war on drugs was right. We're also responsible. So we, the Anglo-American, power created that problem, and then we solve it, right? That I don't know. It's complicated. Yeah, it's I don't know what. I mean, it's certainly the case that the Anglo-American tradition isn't. I don't mean to, dismiss the entire thing, right? I don't mean to say. I think it's what we have is important. What we have is necessary. I think part of my concern is when it's sort of introduced without consent, or it's introduced under pressure, or it's kind of part of a kind of colonizing mission, or that it wields undue influence in cases where there may be other avenues for reconciliation, other avenues for generating peace, other avenues for and I think part of my worry, and this, actually, you've kind of mentioned the English language a few times. I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o's work is coming to mind here. The worry, in the same way that there is this sort of Faustian bargain in the English language, lets us communicate, enables us to sort of have these conversations, but at a certain cost, right? And I worry, I guess, that as the Anglo-American legal system continues to be globalized, what is being lost, right? What other ways of being in the world? What kind of, and part of it is that these legal traditions are tied so much to, or sort of premised on, a sort of privileging of individualism, right? And it's tied to this sort of free market obsession, and a legal system that is, and I think maybe those, because of that, and because of the era that we're in terms of global capitalism, those legal systems kind of find footing in a way that seems less colonial than it might have in the in the early 20th century under the British Empire, but I don't think that's a net positive necessarily, right? I think that there are sort of other ways of being in the world that aren't obsessed with a kind of toxic individualism that's directly part of these global capitalist systems that are lost, that can be lost, anyway, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but you get the idea, right? Sorry.
No, fantastic. Also, because these are real questions, they're not rhetorical. It's not like I'm going to tell you, I
yeah,
have the answer right here.
No. Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, it's thought provoking, and that's kind of why I'm rambling. But yeah.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think that was very well put. I think the thing that occurs to me to kind of add that kind of came out of this collection is, in between the different articles in the collection, there does seem to be a kind of interesting spectrum between kind of theorizations of law and literature that see literature as kind of exterior to the law and potentially in a contentious relationship with the law, or even like radically heterogeneous to the law. I remember that being a big part of Meady's the way that she set up her argument, but also kind of many others who also kind of see it more as a kind of participatory relationship, right? Where literature and different cultural forms, are kind of coming to the table, like I'm thinking of Married to the Shepherds, about the Rwandan film, and how that kind of undertakes a certain kind of translation of the sort of kind of positivist legal tradition, or kind of English, like Anglo legal tradition that kind of was prevalent there. And so I think that article's work of translation, I think, helped to kind of set up this way in which, well, this point of view, these kind of legal concepts need to be kind of translated into a life world. And that work of translation is something that we can see. Now, yeah, I mean, I think that's a long way from answering some of these big systemic issues, but at the same time, that kind of dichotomy between literature as radically heterogeneous versus literature as something that's trying to kind of transform the legal culture is one that really seems to me like an open question of this collection, right? Like, I'm not sure that I'm quite convinced that there's any that it's not a kind of matter of emphasis more than like theoretical. It has to be one or the other.
Yeah. I was also thinking of the piece by Chudhuri, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the last name, right? Over and Against the Law, Migration, Secularism, and Women of Color Feminisms in the Satanic Verses and the Year of the Runaways. So when I read that piece, when I came to it, the whole awful thing that happened to Rushdie had already happened, and that piece read very differently in light of that event. Would you care to comment, perhaps?
On that piece in light of what happened to Rushdie?
Yeah. He's, oh my goodness, is fleeing, this for so long and getting stabbed.
Yeah, well, that was heartbreaking, eh?
Yeah.
Rushdie's a kind of complicated figure, complicated writer, but he's long been a favorite writer of mine, and that was just awful. I don't know. I kind of want to reread it now, thinking about that. I mean, I reread it for today, but that incident came to mind as I was reading. I don't know, David, if you have.
Well, yeah, I mean, the phrase that I'm going to paraphrase, but the phrase that stands out to me from that article is the way that kind of the public sphere for immigrant subjects. I mean, she was kind of especially focused on feminism, but. There is a part of that article that kind of addresses immigrant subjects more broadly, but the secular public sphere is a space of violence and vulnerability, and I mean, I think this certainly brings that home.
Yeah, absolutely. Also because in that article, she does engage with the matter of the fatwa and the impossibility of thinking. Women of color feminisms, right? So the charge against Rushdie, one way of understanding it is, I mean, A, he writes in English, right? and B, he's imposing, these Western ways, such as feminism, on the poor, unsuspecting women characters in his books, and by extension, society at large. So it's kind of like a point of friction, right? We have spoken until now about friction in a more perhaps abstract way, but the Rushdie incident really brings it home for me, and reminds me how our views will have unfortunately angry rebukes, because it's when dealing with the nature of the law and interrogating with literature, be it because we regard law itself as a cultural phenomenon, as part of culture, or as you were saying, because literature is facing the law, we tread in really perilous grounds. It's kind of unavoidable.
Yeah, which is sort of an interesting kind of place to be in, an interesting field to be in. When I first decided to study literature, it seemed like I don't know, just reading poetry and talking about Shakespeare, but I've found myself over time just drawn more and more to some of these issues that just felt it's sometimes a little hard to convince I don't know, legal practitioners that I've met that there are really essential things that we can learn from these literary texts, from this kind of criticism that's very practical, right? That's very kind of applicable to real situations, and yeah, but it is, and I think it's important for people to recognize that.
I'm going to segue in a moment into asking about your current work. I wanted to point out a couple of takeaways. This is a research group. So your emphasis also on how concepts come into being in different legal and literary traditions, I think is going to stay with us here in the group. And I wonder how we could relate that with the question of violence, right? Because you have all of these legal concepts that surround violence, but violence is this thing that's kind of like unavoidable, and maybe I'm taking my cues here from Roberto Bolaño, irreducible, and a problem. Okay, I will never, at least not lightly, right? Advocate violence in any kind of like legal struggle. Then there's also the question of diversity, right? The diversity of legal literary traditions that can interestingly get lost when we are wearing the Anglo-American eyeglasses on top of the Anglo-American eyeglasses that we already have, because we cannot quite get rid of those. I have found in teaching texts with undergraduate students that have to do with law and so on. But why isn't there a jury in this short story? You're like, well, not all legal traditions have a jury, right? But if we are immersed in the culture that we are immersed in, Hollywood and so on, around the world, you refer to the jury and to the scene of the judge and the participants in the American model to an extent that you look at a different film like Argentina 1985, and you wonder, why are people sitting there in that room? It's so awkward. It's not like Perry Mason. Anyways, David, what are you up to? What's the latest? And Peter, what are you up to as well?
Well, I'm currently doing. I'm starting a project right now that I don't know. It's still kind of early days, so I don't know quite yet whether it will be law and literature in kind of the robust sense. But it's certainly come out of my kind of engagement with that interdiscipline. I'm looking to. I guess I'm looking to concepts of the secular as they're kind of understood across different countries, across different sort of parts of the world. And I want to kind of I want to do a kind of comparative study about kind of how the concept of the secular kind of appears different in different contexts and has different utility. So that's one of the big kind of bridges. I guess to me, the crux of it, the crux of the work that I want to do is that, rather than thinking of the secular in terms of something that's kind of in opposition to the religious, or something that's about kind of the distraction, the subtraction of religion from the public sphere. I want to kind of reposition the secular as in terms of material space, right? The idea of what it takes to share a material space with a community, with other stakeholders, and what it means to think about possessing it in common. All of these to me seem like kind of more kind of foundational elements of the secular that kind of get pushed aside when the debate between, like, in kind of a lot of the post-secular debates that we have that really do kind of focus more on kind of the place of theology and religion. I guess I'm interested in any kind of absolutist claim that needs to kind of ownership or possession. Like, from this point of view, basically, private property would be very antithetical to the idea of the secular. And so, yeah, I'm sort of interested in looking at how a number of literary texts kind of try to work through that ambiguity. I came to this through readings of Ngugi and J.M. Coetzee, but I'm still kind of looking for other works to flesh that out. So,
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I've got a few different things kind of that I'm trying to work on. The main project, though, is a little bit of a departure from other things that I've done. There are kind of law and literature elements to it, but it's a departure in terms of genre and method, all of the above. My paternal grandmother was a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe. She's Native American, born and raised in Arizona on the reservation there. And when I was growing up, she would tell us this story about this alleged ancestor of ours, an Apache leader from the 19th century, who was this very significant figure who led sort of this unification effort of the Apache in fighting against Mexico and the United States in the mid to late 19th century. But he was infamously taken prisoner by the U.S. military, brought in, taken prisoner, killed, and then the army surgeon cut his head off and took his skull. And there was a rumor for years that it was sent to the Smithsonian. And she and my father both, just over the years, would just kind of muse on, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could retrieve that skull? And a few years ago, just kind of out of curiosity, I started thinking about this and thinking about the sort of colonial history in my own family and the ways in which the land that I walk on, I mean, here in Utah, kind of learning more and more about, I mean, I spent so much time kind of studying some of these issues in East Africa and these, places that where I wasn't raised, and I realized this is actually very present, right? These issues are much more immediate than to my own kind of family history and the land that I live on. So I started thinking about these things and started looking for this skull, and it has turned into a full kind of search for this missing remain and an investigation of the relationship between certain literary practices. There's, looking at poetry and horror film and some fiction that deals with remains, like native remains and missing remains. And I'm kind of looking at these things, searching for this skull, looking for this story, this family story, at the same time that I'm looking at some of these cultural artifacts, cultural texts, and then kind of studying the history of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the sort of laws in the U.S. that that are supposed to govern the return of artifacts and remains and so on and so forth. And so it's been partly an archival project, partly a textual analysis project, and partly going around interviewing people, knocking on doors. I managed to get the Skull and Bones Secret Society to open their front door and talk to me, which, yeah, they weren't very happy that I was there, but they answered my question. The guy who was there, it led to a really, really interesting conversation. So anyway, so it's kind of a mix of kind of personal narrative with some both material and textual investigation into these kind of legal and cultural issues.
May I suggest, and in the interest of hopefully continuing conversations, David, The Magic of the State, that book would really, I think, speak to your current interest on the relationship between the concepts of the secular and private property. Joe, remind me the author of The Magic of the State. My mind is drawing a blank here.
Michael Tausig.
Thank you very much, Mick Tausig, of course. And then Peter, I'm going to, and everyone, I'm going to send a link on the chat to a film. It's a rarity, but it's quite amazing, called Damiana Krigi. The story also of a skull of a girl who was in indentured servitude at Frenocomio in the outskirts of Buenos Aires under Alejandro Korn, who was this philosopher, right? And when this girl dies, her skull ends up being studied, and it ends up going from Buenos Aires to Berlin to the Ethnologisches Museum. The kind of work that film does with the whole problem of repatriation and remain/person dimension of things I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also on that note, I think, Joseph, your own research on desaparecidos might have some connections there, or
yeah, we've talked about that a little bit.
Yes, indeed, and we had more conversations.
Plans to meet and talk. Yeah.
Yes. But I think one of the things with desaparecidos, or thinking with all the other things that have been brought up, a couple questions, thinking about law and literature and law as culture, but also other aspects of cultural possession, is the nation state frame, right? When thinking from something like the Global South, and this is something that is very much on my mind with thinking about desaparecidos. Tendai Achiume, a human rights lawyer, gave a talk here the other day, essentially saying there is no emancipatory future with the nation state frame. The only way to get out of this is to go beyond that, right? A very strong statement, but I think an important one to sit with and think on, and think about with the way academic production in Global North universities works, right? There is a focus on understanding desaparecidos in the Colombian frame, or in this journal issue, right? There is a focus on, for the most part, these nation state frames. And we've also had the chance to think about with Adam Getachew and this idea of anti-colonial world making, which has, let's say, a more optimistic spin on the nation state frame as a way to create a world order through international relations that isn't as perhaps pessimistic as my thinking at the moment.
That's really interesting. I just real quick, we had, I don't know if you know Jed Esty, postcolonial modernist scholar. He was just here for a couple of days at BYU, and we had a similar kind of conversation about the nation state and the sort of limitations of how we see everything through that inevitably. But and we were talking about genres, kind of genre systems, and how all of our kind of genre systems. But he had a kind of more positive outlook that there may be a way of kind of thinking beyond the nation state that will be ultimately productive. And I don't know, it left me a little more hopeful than I normally am, actually. So
yeah, I feel that global managerialism is haunting our conversation, and that is a project in which law is really immersed, through things like copyright and others, and it's, to me, quite interesting because it connects two areas of interest, new materialism and talk about the concrete and the legal, because once the legal becomes implemented and it gains the force of law, we're already talking about infrastructure, so words become more than words through legal acts, and that's quite fascinating. I wanted to make sure that we have time to interact with the amazing folks who are joining us. So what I'd like to propose, if you'll agree, is that we stop recording and open up the webinar.
Sounds great.